So welcome to the latest Open Mind podcast. Craig and I are delighted. We've got two guests, two really interesting guests today. So first of all, we've got Nick Morgan, and Nick's going to talk about the work he's been doing as a founder of Euro Youth Mental Health. And then also we'll be chatting to Chryssi. I'm really excited to hear about Chryssi's journey and story. And Chryssi's an activist and a sort of advocate and person with lived experience in the field of mental health. So welcome both Nick and Chryssi.
Hello, thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
No, looking forward to our conversation. Okay, so maybe we'll just kick off maybe with you first, Nick, and tell us a bit about, so I've been watching a couple of videos on YouTube and the work that you've been doing. Could maybe tell us, before we get to the sort of, well, not the end point, but Euro Youth Mental Health, but maybe what brought you there? And I know you've spoken about your own mental health experiences. So just maybe tell us a bit about you and your experiences to date.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm a youth worker by trade and kind of studied at university from Swansea. Sort of classed as an emotional child. Not that meant anything in the 90s. And yeah, I guess I got into youth work and fell into mental health by accident, working for charities, but not as a clinician or anything, but using youth work kind of socializing skills about motivation and that sort of thing to work with young people with maybe early symptoms of mental ill health, or on the other side, kind of coming out of inpatient wards and needing some support to navigate managing their mental health, to live independently or back with their family. And so I did that for quite a number of years, fell in love with the field of mental health, but whilst doing that at the same time, and there could be a long discussion about cause and effect, but I think it was inevitable. I remember one particular time when, I'd never really felt as someone who struggles with their mental health per se, whilst doing the job initially, and then on my way to a school to do some work with in one-to-ones with some pupils at a school, just broke down in the car crying. Had absolutely no idea why that was, but just called my office and kind of like, I can't go in. I can't kind of compose myself, and so I went to managed to get some free counselling with work. Luckily, it's not the case everywhere. And yeah, I guess that just opened the door to my kind of acknowledgement of varying degrees of mental health and mental ill health. I am diagnosed with depression and general anxiety disorder now, which I didn't find out until about 5 years after I got diagnosed with it, apparently. And that was as an adult. So
so when did that happen? That experience of just
that was when I was about 22.
Okay.
So like a year or two after uni, and yeah, just got some counselling, and since then it's been a bit, my mental health's been an up and down journey, as all of our mental health is, and I've had periods of severe difficulty where I've had weeks, months off work, from kind of depressive episodes, to the total opposites, episodes of pure joy and excitement and happiness, and managing all that. So that was when I was about 22. Like I said, I did lots of different bits of work for various charities around mental health, and then I went to do a master's in Maastricht in the south of the Netherlands. And for my thesis, it was a comparative study, comparative European social sciences was the course.
All right.
Yeah, which was really interesting. And the idea for your thesis is you had to do a comparative study. So I wanted to compare a mental health service in Zagreb, Croatia, to a service in London, UK. So I used one, and it was during that time that scoping Europe as a continent and a region, looking at mental health, I saw the huge disparity, I guess, amongst education, services, awareness, acceptance, and also a complete lack of kind of a regional wide organization kind of doing anything to campaign or to advocate on behalf of young people, or with young people, which is what we've set up.
Yeah. Can I just stop you there for a second and bring you back a bit there? So a couple of things just struck me. So you were saying, was it that you were diagnosed at the time, but you didn't know that, or?
Yeah, it is an interesting conversation. And I guess as someone who's worked in the field, I know how difficult it can be to get a diagnosis as an adult compared to that of a young person under 18. And I was never looking. I never kind of talked about it, but I was in and out. I've been in and out of the GP and varying levels of support since that incident when I was 22. And I can't remember exactly, but I think I had this really good GP in Hitchin, actually, where I'm living now, who was calling me up every 2 weeks for a short period of time, checking in on me. Yeah, very unheard of. And I think in one phone call they said, well, the first one I had with them, they were kind of looking at my records and said, so I can see you've got a diagnosis of clinical depression and general anxiety disorder. And I was kind of like, oh, have I? That's good to know. And I think she said, I think sounds like what happened is, you do the tests, the strengths and difficulties questionnaires and things like that. I obviously scored over the limit
threshold,
threshold a certain amount of times, and I just don't think, because I'm an adult, they're like, oh yeah, that's not that. It's not. They can't offer me anything because of it. It's not like I've got extra treatment because I got a diagnosis.
Well, I was just curious when you said that. So I mean, it's an interesting point, because sometimes, well, actually, there's some research, not specific to mental health, but there's some research I remember coming across a few years ago, and just in psychology more generally, which looked at when you go into your GP, right, and obviously in your consultation, you have a conversation and the GP will give you advice or whatever happens. And then they did this study in which they asked people, what did your GP tell you? And like most people don't actually remember accurately what their GP tells them. So it's really interesting bit just how that patient health professional interaction goes. Now, I'm not saying that happened to you, but it just came into my head there.
That's it. It just felt like a passing conversation. As if it really didn't actually matter that much, which it doesn't, because I think for me, in my experiences and also my professional experiences, diagnosis can be helpful for certain things but only if it helps you with recovering or managing your mental health. Whereas the more adult you are, I think the less they think, well, it's clearly not impacting. He's working. He's not a risk to himself or anyone else. So
I think obviously the role of diagnoses is serve, as you say, many different functions, and one obviously is to have a shared knowledge or shared label to help, so we can communicate what we think is happening. But obviously, as we know, with both depression and anxiety, there are a collection of symptoms, and the presentation of those symptoms is very different for everyone. So so then fast forward down, I'm just curious, and moving ahead then, and so you did your first degree in the UK, but hold on, so Maastricht, where did that come from?
So I was looking I was getting to a particular time in my life where what do I want to do next? I think I was living in, where was I living at this point? Maybe Brighton. I think I was in Brighton by this point. I've got around. And I was looking to do a social work master's. Now, my degree is in community education. It's more commonly known now as youth and community work. Social work in the UK, at least, has a very strict kind of criteria in order to do a master's. Whereas in different places in Europe, I learned this when I did go to Maastricht. It can be a variety of things. In the UK, it's a very strict definition of a social worker. So basically, long story short, I couldn't do a social work master's because I didn't have a social work degree, even though my experience and my career in safeguarding, working in severe mental health trauma units and things like that, all of that didn't matter because I didn't do this social work.
You haven't got the piece of paper.
We love our paper in the UK. So I looked for something else. I was looking for international social work, and there were a couple of things, and then I fell upon this course. It was a collaborative course between Maastricht Zoid University and London Metropolitan.
Okay, great.
So I lived in Maastricht for 6 months. It had 20 people on the course from different places in Europe, with social workers, youth workers, social pedagogues, those sorts of roles. And the idea is that you learn a lot about European institutions, about the nuances of social work and how it came about in Europe and what the differences are across the world. And then the end piece of work that you have to do is a comparative study of some kind.
Okay.
And I did mine in, I think I called it informal services for mental health support. One in the UK and one in Zagreb, Croatia. So whilst doing that, I noticed, as I talked about earlier, that there wasn't much going on from a regional point of view around kind of youth organizations. There's a couple of kind of general European-wide mental health organizations, which you may know about, Mental Health Europe and an organization called Gamayan and a couple of others, but there was nothing focusing specifically on youth. So I spoke to a couple of these organizations to kind of get a lay of the land initially just set it up as a Twitter page, as kind of just trying to get, and I was just using it to retweet other young people who seemed to be young. I was very much going based on the pictures they posted and the things they were saying from across Europe, just to try and echo the voice and tag in institutions and things. And then at the behest of my colleagues from university, who kept nagging me to set it up as a formal organization, I gave in eventually and set it up. 12th of December 2017.
Okay.
We became a community interest company. And initially at that point, it was myself and a colleague, Irina Buriana, who isn't part of our group anymore, but there was no kind of hard feelings of separation. She went on to do her own thing, but helped in the initial phases.
And so that's 5 years ago. Chryssi, we'll bring you in a wee second. So the reason you went the Euro angle is that was just informed by, in part, your experiences in Maastricht and doing the masters, and then recognizing there was this gap. So then, what's your sort of vision for, or what was the vision for Euro youth mental health?
As you might, what I haven't touched on is throughout my career, I've very heavily lent into kind of shared decision making and collaborative work with young people, asking them what they want and doing our best to advocate and support them in achieving that and having that work. And a lot of my work now, day to day, is around youth involvement in research as co-producers, not just as participants, and also getting young people's voices at high level meetings, and I've done that in the UK for a while. And then so this organization is very much around advocacy and campaigning from young people for young people. So we act in order to raise up the voices of young people, to promote mental health and support those impacted by mental ill health across Europe. That's the mission statement.
Well, that's a nice way then to bring in. I'll come back to some more on the groundwork that you've been doing, Nick. But maybe a great way to introduce then Chryssi. So Chryssi, you're obviously doing a lot of activism work, and Nick and you know each other. So do you mind tell us a bit about your story and how you got involved in the advocacy, activism, and sort of lived experience work?
Yes, of course. Growing up, I had a very happy and normal childhood. I was a very happy child and everything. But maybe because of some life events while growing up, especially teenage years, I developed, let's say, symptoms of anxiety and depression. I wasn't diagnosed, and I am still not diagnosed, but I had very intense episodes of depression, and especially during my teenage years, I was feeling kind of lost. And I feel like teenage years are in general hard. They are not depicted as such many times because they are expected to be very fun, but I feel in reality they can be very tricky, these years in the life of a person, because of the changes that happen and everything. You have to make decisions. You feel very lost and small in front of all of these things. And because of that, and because some other life events that happened, I started feeling something was off at first. And then I admitted that to myself, that this is not something feeling off. It's something more, it's something deeper. It's something like that could be described as depressive episodes. And mental health was something very important to me in my life. And because of my lived experience and because of my interests in general. And this is the reason why I decided to study social work. As Nick said, I studied something else, but then I reevaluated my choice of degree, and after my first year I decided that I wanted to change my degree, and I went for social work, which I never regretted, and I am now very close to graduating.
So where and in terms of, is that in the UK? Are you training to do social work in the UK or in Europe? Or elsewhere in Europe, obviously. Sorry, elsewhere. That was controversial there.
I have been. I was born and I have lived my whole life in Greece. Mm-hmm. So I also study in Greece, and it was maybe easier for me than it was for Nick to study because it was my bachelor. So it wasn't the master, because it's still difficult for us to become social workers if we don't have the bachelor degree here. Mm-hmm. But since I was still very young and it was my bachelor degree, I decided to just change. And here I am. About my involvement with Youth Mental Health, it happened during the first quarantine. Mm-hmm. I was found with so much more free time as many other people. And I felt like I wanted to volunteer and do something nice with my time, not because I wanted to be like productive in a strict way, in the strict definition of the word, but I also wanted to feel connected with other people, because I felt very isolated and the opportunities that I had were not so many. And I also live on an island, which didn't help so much. Not at all. Not only during quarantine in general, but especially during quarantine. So I came across an advertisement. I think it popped up on my Instagram stories. And it was something very interesting. And I was like, maybe that would be a nice fit for me. So I filled in a form for new activists, and the rest is history.
So that brings us in back. So then to Nick then, and so in terms of the organization, so part of the role is obviously raise a profile and to try and advocate for, I assume, better services, better support. So tell us a bit more about what you do in that sphere.
Yeah, we're all volunteers, it's worth noting, myself included. We all have different varying day jobs. I work in the field, some of the volunteers don't, and do this as a volunteer thing using their skills. Yeah, some of the spheres that we work in. So there's a lot of kind of things that we do together. So we have a network of young people from across Europe who are willing to maybe do some short videos, help us with content and blogs and those sorts of things, as well as maybe attend events and high level profile meetings. One of which me and Chryssi went to last year, which I'll come back to in a second, and kind of ensure that young people's voices are always on the table at those kind of conversations. Something I'm currently involved in with the World Health Organization Europe is figuring out how best to involve young people in their conversations. I've been involved with them during COVID as a technical advisor, representing Euro Youth Mental Health. So I always came with quotes from young people and always mentioned, why aren't there enough young people here? Mm-hmm. And now they're looking into kind of finding some funding, because to do it properly, you need, the thing with co-productions, I think, is people think, I've just spoke to some young people, it's fine, but you need proper funding to do it properly. And then the other side of that, which I guess was always the aim and is finally starting to happen, is, as I touched on earlier, the importance, I think, of involving young people with lived experience as peer researchers on research projects. So it's on their website, so I'm sure we can talk about it. We've been accepted as part of a European-wide piece of research that's going to be looking into the role of genetic and environmental factors in mental health of young people. It's being led by Maastricht University. Total coincidence.
Come round in a circle.
Yeah, I know, it's very weird. Although the odd thing is there's two universities in Maastricht. This is the other one, which was classed as the better one, but inverted commas. So and we're part of quite a few of a bit like that's a 5-year piece of work, and so we've got funding, to start funding some roles.
So just stop here for a second then. So how did that come about? Well, two things. One is how did the links with the World Health Organization come about, and then second, how in terms of involvement in these research studies, because often they can be very serendipitous things. But so maybe we could, because I think it'd be really helpful for listeners who maybe others who are thinking of establishing advocacy or how we can move this field forward, especially in embedding youth lived experience in research and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth noting, look, one thing we're looking to gain when we get more funding as well is to do a lot of training for exactly that sort of thing, so that people can feel comfortable to, because these sorts of fundings often end up at universities. It's not necessarily charities that, as you probably know, Rory. And so as an NGO, we don't necessarily come under that belt, but we did a project through word of mouth that was funded by the Wellcome Trust on an international project called Active Ingredients, which was linked heavily with UCL and the Anna Freud National Centre for Children.
Yeah, was that the active ingredients for mental health treatments, was it?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. And so we led the youth engagement on the initial, there were 2 initial projects before it went into what the current bid is, and we were one of the lead youth engagement teams of that piece of work.
Great, that's fantastic.
And then it was just through a bit of work, to be quite a bit of word of mouth, a bit of hustling, a bit of if I'm being perfectly frank, putting myself out there and challenge and being challenging. I think a lot of people feel a bit awkward or uncomfortable calling people and organizations and work out for not doing X, Y, or Z. I think we always try to be nice, and rightly so. And I usually only do it to highlight certain pieces of work could be better if you had a young person help you write. You might have got that bid if you had a young person help you write that ethics part, or help you deliver that piece of work to a funding board, and so on. So there is an element of that, and then going back to the World Health Organization, I think just before COVID there was some work going on with a youth advisory group I'd seen online, Global Mental Health Peer Network. I think I contacted them, told them about what we were doing. I got invited to as an expert on a technical advisory group during COVID. And just a lot of just constantly. It's surprising how much you can do by just throwing yourself out there and being, I guess, a bit persistent and patient.
Well, I think I agree. And I think that's really good advice, and is often that people don't know where to turn to for looking for that sort of advice or support. So Chryssi, back to you then. Obviously, from what I can gather, then you and Nick attended some meeting together. So what, in terms of what work have you been doing with Nick and others?
Yes, of course. In our organization, there are many roles, and someone can get involved no matter how much time they have, or no matter what skills they have or not. So there are different ones based on all these things that I mentioned before. And right now I am part of the organization as an activist and an expert by experience. That means that at first I would, as an activist, I would create content for our social media channels. But then, like, all of us help each other when a new project comes up. So we may need to take up a new task or help someone, and it's really flexible, the roles and the task and the time that you can devote it. All of them are very flexible. But also, as expert by experience, we may be invited in a podcast, like now, for example, or at a summit like the one that we mentioned before. And this is something very empowering for us. It can also be helpful for the organizations or policymakers, but I think it's also something very important for the person that is invited to do so, because you feel like your story is worth telling, and you feel seen, and you feel that what you want to say is important. There are people that actually want to hear you. and your story and your recommendations and everything. And I feel it's especially important for young people and in general people who struggle with their mental health, because we normally don't have so many opportunities, because our modern societies are very competitive, and in order to have an opportunity you have to be very competitive or productive. If you're not one of those, then you don't have opportunities, and that means that a vicious cycle is made, because I don't have self-esteem, I don't do enough, I don't get a reward, and then lower self-esteem. And so when I was given the opportunity, for example, to speak at such an event, I felt so empowered, and I know that I would never have the opportunity to do something like that if it wasn't for this organization.
Yeah, no, I think it's brilliant. And there's some whatever heart thing that's those of you who are listening to this, that Nick has done some whatever heart thing with this.
A weird heart thing with my hands.
Trying to be cool, I think, as my kids would say. So, actually, it's funny you're wearing a baseball cap. I wore a baseball cap on holidays, and my kids, I did what you did, Nick. And for a laugh, I turned it around because Nick's got his baseball cap on back to front. And my kids were literally horrified and said a 49-year-old man should not be wearing a baseball cap.
I mean, my better half tells me I shouldn't be wearing a baseball cap backwards all the time, but I still do.
That's my entire style.
Nick, back to you for a second. You've given us some kernels of sort of wisdom. So in turn, if you're somebody listening to this who's thinking, actually, I'm really keen to try and get young people's voices out there, and say if you just focus on research, this is sort of a research-related podcast. So what advice would you give? Or, well, obviously contact your organization would be one, I assume. But if somebody was looking separately from that, what advice would you give?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think some of the main things I would give as advice in trying to get young people, so like and especially if you want local young people involved in your work, is if you don't have something set up yourself, you've got to fund for someone or an organization to help, if you don't have it already in your university or in your charity, to help you set up official protocols and things around involving young people safely, supportively, meaningfully, as Chryssi said, to feel empowered and to feel comfortable to do such opportunities. It's not, you can't just go into a youth club and throw a bunch of research papers and ask them if it's all right. But I do think then on the flip side, it's one thing. So staff need to be trained effectively and understand the meaningfulness of it, and and you can easily sell it with the outcomes, the positive outcomes that co-production produces. Then on the flip side, it is about, I think something I've noticed is around training and doing workshops with young people about their experiences. I think the term expert by experience, especially on an international level, means all sorts of things in different countries, as you can imagine. But to really pick that apart with young people and actually recognize, as again, Chryssi, you just mentioned, that people do actually want to hear your stories, and your everything you've done today can be used to benefit something that happens in the future. You don't have to be an expert by learning or science or theory to do some of this stuff.
But actually, just want to come in there for a sec. That point you make about even terminology in an international context, because I was talking to somebody recently who more in the suicide prevention field, and he was telling me he lives in Indonesia, that the term lived experience doesn't translate, it's not used. And also there's no the issue about lived experience, living experience, expert by experience. So I think it's, but I suppose we're all, doesn't matter which country we're in, I think there is, well, slowly but surely, and there's different speeds at different countries, there is that growing recognition of the vital and central importance of having living expert by experience at the heart of everything, but not just, because I think co-production sometimes is only one part of the process of research. It's like, but it's having young people in even before the projects, in this case, young people before the project has started. I know good co-production is at all stages, but I think it's really, really important. It's not just, as you just said, like they're maybe, oh, here, just look at these materials type thing often, but it's not. It's at all stages of design as well.
Yeah, but what on the contrast to that as well, though, although this sounds very conflicting, what I will say is I think sometimes there can be an element of expectation on researchers or professionals to involve young people, as you said in this case, to such an extent that it actually puts them off the idea of even bothering to try. So it's kind of like, I don't know, we don't have the funding or the capacity to do all of this. And so there's also the other side of being like, just as long as you can justify and be transparent about why you can only involve them in X, Y, or Z, whether it's just at the dissemination stage, that's okay. It's still involvement and it's still engagement at a certain level. And it's just important to try and make the effort to do so, and hopefully, as you talked about learning points, the more you do it intermittently, the more the next bid you put in, you might be like, right, let's get this right from the start. And
at some stages, depending on the nature of the research, I mean, it's the nature of the research and the practical, there will be practical constraints as well. So absolutely, no, I think that's really helpful. So again, as thinking of this as a research podcast, and so a question to both of you, maybe I'll go to Chryssi first in this one, Chryssi. So could you tell us maybe what are your hopes and aspirations? If somebody said to you, what's the big research question you would like us as the research field to address? What do you think we should be focusing in on? It doesn't have to be just whatever comes into your head.
To be honest, I haven't been very much involved academically. I'm in research, but I think sometimes we don't pay so much attention to some factors that can contribute to our mental health or lack of it. Of course, for example, it's important to have accessible mental health services, but there are also some other things like, for example, my university can have some psychologists, but if they don't specialize in something that I may struggle with, they may harm me more. Or if the financial situation of my country is really bad, that can affect me in ways that, mentally, in ways that someone cannot understand or detect, because it doesn't seem linked to the mental health of the people. But it's not, because, for example, part of the anxiety that I feel is because of the financial situation or the situation in the workplace of people. So maybe I would like to see the link between some factors that haven't been investigated.
So for somebody who claims not to be that embedded in the research, you've done pretty well there. There are great suggestions and ideas, and I think it really highlights what we sometimes describe or talk about, that is the idea of the person in context, and we've ignored the context for too long, or we haven't given due consideration. So I think they're great. That's great points, Chryssi. Thanks. So Nick, same question for you in terms of what would you think is a burning research question in the field of youth mental health? Say.
I was thinking about this as you were chatting, and my brain started going quite big, sort of philosophically looking at capitalism and kind of systems. But I think for me, it would be how does the current education system directly impact young people's mental health? Which I know is a very broad, it sounds straightforward, but is obviously a ridiculously broad question. This is a personal bugbear as a youth worker, but I currently don't think education systems fit for purpose, and I do think that has such a big impact on young people's development, and it is the expectations and the results-driven culture and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think what impact does that have, and what could be changed systematically in education that would help benefit young people to look after their mental health.
But I'm even just thinking, so even the time schools start, because we know the adolescent brain is not tailored to an 8:30, 8:45, 9 a.m. start. And so we even know basics, and I agree there's something in having a system which is facilitating or is more holistic. It's not, I know we do talk about obviously personal and social development in schools, but yeah, there is a wider question about, is the academic focus on academic that still the be all and end all? And with potentially detrimental impact on wider mental health and well-being.
If I may add on to that, I think the reason that really came highlighted is that we were at an event called European Youth Event that happens every 2 years, and we were there last year, but we were there 3 years prior to that, and we did a workshop with something like 80 young people from across Europe and beyond, and we did an exercise where we came up with what are the three main things that, and this is obviously 4 years ago now, and so maybe not relevant per se, but three things that you think that impact you as your mental health the most. So things that impact your mental health in a kind of difficult way, and those three things were employment, which in my head relates purely, to money and security, relationships. I do a bit of work going into schools talking about healthy relationships with another charity, because that we don't get taught what a good relationship looks
really
like.
important.
I can't remember, equality was the way they worded it, but I think that was more the early stages of conversations about being accessible to everyone, knowing more about the diverse world in which we live in, because it doesn't really get talked about, say neurodivergence and history of Black culture and LGBTQ pride. You don't get taught about that. You might touch on it in history, but it's about history, not about and so those three things, I'm like, they should all be in school. I mean, mental health should have its own thing in school, but so that's kind of why I think there's such big topics as well.
Have you seen any current trends happening in Europe in terms of young people's mental health?
I mean, from my experience, a general amount of overwhelmingness, if I'm being perfectly honest. A lot, if not all, of our violent activists, and I think I've got so much on all the time, and I don't know who. You could argue there's an element of self ability to do that. I'm rubbish at saying no to things. But I do think there's something in that I think is the burnout and kind of anxiety that induces, the ability to please everyone, and this kind of nature. And I could go on for ages about this, but you could argue there's an element of, because you have more access to things now with video calls, social, Facebook started it. Sorry for those who aren't watching, we just had a cat enter the conversation from Chryssi. I think it's all now, we feel like because we can access everything from anywhere, that we should be accessing anything from everywhere. I was asked to travel 2.5 hours to meet a friend for a coffee the other day, and I contemplated it for a while, and I was like, no, I can't, that's silly. So I think that for me is a trend, I guess, as I'm 38, an old professional looking in on young people's trends of Europe. I don't know, Chryssi, in terms of you as a young person, maybe just amongst your peers, is there anything you think young people are you're noticing in general around mental health at the moment?
Yeah, first of all, sorry for my cat's intervention. She wanted to say something, I don't know what.
No apology needed. The more animals, the better.
That's the first cat we've had.
Yeah, it is. We've had dogs. We had a couple of dogs.
But from my aspect, I agree with Nick in general, and we're all very obsessed with being productive. I feel this productivity thing is becoming very toxic, probably because, as I said, everything is becoming very competitive, and we all want to stay on top of things. Maybe it's also because of social media, because we only see the peaks of someone's life, and we compare our whole life with the peaks of someone's life. But I would also like to maybe add a more optimistic view. Based on my experience, I see that most of my friends and people my age now see a therapist, for example, or seek help. Because someone can say that this is not good, because it means that all of us struggle, but it also means that there is less shame and stigma around mental health issues. And now I don't feel weird if I say, for example, that I see a therapist. It's actually a very casual discussion, even in more conservative countries or regions like mine. And it brings me hope because I feel like we normalize mental health issues and talking about mental health, and yeah, there's less stigma, and for me it's something very hopeful. And I also feel like maybe our generation will do more to end trauma or shame around mental health that we have inherited from past generations, and I would be very happy to see that.
I think it's so true, actually, and I think there has been this generational shift, which is great to see. As somebody who's got teenage kids, I mean, the way they talk about mental health is so different, certainly from when I was their age, which is great. So it's fantastic. No, thanks for that, Chryssi. Really, really helpful. Okay, time is getting the better of us, and so it's for time to sort of bring things to a close. And no, thanks a million for really, really interesting discussion, and I think really hopefully important advice for engaging young people and working with young people in that co-production approach, Nick and Chryssi, which is fantastic and that, and the importance of advocacy. So the last sort of question, just as a sort of slightly different, just to end, trying to end with something slightly different on the podcast is, so maybe if I go with Nick first. Nick's doing something funny with his cap. I don't know what he's doing, but anyway, so Nick, the question first to you is, so reflecting obviously on your experiences to date, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
Invest in craft beer. No, sorry, irrelevant. 16-year-old self, I think, I mean, it's hard, but I think it'd be something about whatever you do, make sure be realistic and honest with your expectations on yourself, and don't be so hard on yourself. I'm a constant self-blamer, and I beat myself up, all the time about things. And speak to yourself like you would a friend is the advice I try to give myself a lot, because I wouldn't speak to a friend like that at all. So I tell my 16-year-old self, speak to yourself like a friend, and set realistic expectations. You can't do everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great piece of advice. It's self-compassion is at the heart of it. And I think as a world, we've got more compassionate, but I still think that our capacity to be self-compassionate still needs a lot of work. And Chryssi, the same question to you. What would you tell your 16-year-old self? What advice? And I know that wasn't that long ago for you, Chryssi.
It's not, but believe me, many things have changed since then. But I would like to tell her a lot. But if I were to say maybe a few sentences, I would say, first of all, most of the things, if not all of the things you worry about will never happen. Because I always made up scenarios, and you shouldn't be worried so much about the future, about everything. And you don't need to have everything figured out. I think that I would say these two things to decrease her anxiety, maybe.
No, absolutely. No, I like that one. You don't have to have everything figured out. I think that is really, really good advice. And then, okay, so two last quick, one to each, a question each of you. So again, thinking of people, this can be anybody living or dead, famous, not famous, but who would you like to say? You were saying, Nick, you nearly traveled 2.5 hours for a coffee with somebody, but who would you travel 2.5 hours, living or dead, famous or not famous, to have a coffee with?
I want to point out that person's no less of a friend. It's just the idea of going 2.5 hours.
No, I agree. I'm with you 100%. Yeah.
Anyway, so just to be quick, first person that popped into my head, because they were an inspiration to forming Eurojouth Mental Health, is a former Italian politician called Altiero Spinelli. Altiero Spinelli is known as the godfather of the European Union. He was instrumental in setting up the European Union, of which I'm a huge fan of and advocate of, ironically not being in it at the moment. That's who I would say. I just love to pick his brains about kind of thinking that
Oh,
had.
good. Yeah, I don't know that person, but as similarly a big fan of the European Union and as an Irish passport holder, I still am in part a member of the European Union despite living in Scotland, which obviously voted to stay in Europe. But a bit of politics there. And then Chryssi.
Yeah, you might still end up back there again.
Chryssi, same for you. So who would you like to have a coffee with? Who wouldn't ordinarily have the chance to have one with?
I feel like it's time to disappoint the audience because I wasn't prepared.
Yeah, no, don't worry. Or if you can't think of anybody, that's fine as well.
Yeah, to be honest, I think that I will do it. I will disappoint because I cannot decide. It's a very interesting question, though. I would like it to be a food for thought for me.
Okay, well, we'll leave that one with you, and then maybe if we catch up with you again at some future date, you can give us the answer to that question. Okay, well, thanks a million, Chryssi and Nick. That was a really, really interesting conversation. And obviously, Nick, there are resources online from obviously for what's your website? What's your website? You give us a shout out for your website.
Yeah, please do if you want to get involved. We'll be recruiting new volunteers soon and building numbers on our Young Expert by Experience Collective. Go to www.eymh.org and you'll see the Get Involved button at the top.
Fantastic. Thanks a million, everybody. Stay well and stay safe and have a great rest of the day. Thanks a million. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much.